and I understand that a number of people will be watching this from the safety and comfort of their icebound homes, maybe. Of the three lectures in a row, in a sense, this is the most awkward, because I suppose by now I'm an old architect, and I've tried to look out people who are older even than me, of which I managed to find several still in the vertical position. But that's not really the point. And in fact, as you will see, at the end of the lecture, I have one person who is carrying over between this week and next week, because next week, the last lecture, is called How to Be an Interesting Architect. And I'm still in the process of getting the bits and pieces together for that one. And that will in some ways be, I hope, the most amusing, but also the most difficult one, because what the hell are the criteria for being interesting? You can draw a line and say, below this line you're young, above this line you're old. That's sort of easy, and of course one's talking in a sense about other issues. I suppose what I'm really, I think the subplot for all of these lectures is really beaming out to you a series of scenarios. In a way, I'm using the particular personalities in a way as anecdote, in a way as things to look at, but in a way as ciphers, as kind of exemplars of types of people. You can forget the particular individual sometimes and say, that kind of person could be me, or reminds me of my old boss, or reminds me of my ambitious younger brother or younger sister, whatever it might be. And I hope that you can extrapolate from this, that it's not all sort of direct information. It to some extent is symbolic. And having imperceptibly moved from youth to age, remaining, I hope, the same personality myself. And sometimes I find myself returning to conversations, not quite sure whether I'm looking at them from the point of view of cynicism, age, and experience, or looking at them just from a slightly different perspective, which isn't related to that. But there are not many advantages to being an old architect, but there are a few advantages, which is that at a certain point you don't have to pretend anymore. And I have noticed it of myself that whatever I say, I can't earn particularly more brownie points. I still want to win competitions, but I can't earn brownie points. Nobody's going to make me a professor if I say or do something. I'm already a professor, so that's cleared that one. I don't have to look over my shoulder saying, was that the right thing to be seen to be saying? And it preoccupies, I think it particularly preoccupies your generation, or the generation a little bit older, you're a younger group than usual today, but looking at the generation slightly older than you. They are absolutely obsessed, whether they are in an office and therefore wanting to be the job leader or an associate or one of these sorts of things, or whether they're in academe and they want to be put up from lecturer grade 3 to lecturer grade 2, or whatever the hell it might be, or an associate, the marvelous term, an associate professor, whatever that means, and it depends which country you come from. Whether, in England, a professor is somebody who stands at a bus stop, probably with their flies undone and their glasses on their head and a gabardine raincoat flapping around their knees. And certainly the term doesn't get you a decent seat in a restaurant. In a small German town or Austrian town, a professor is somebody which can certainly get you a good seat in a restaurant, and you would never be seen dead in a gabardine raincoat. In professor, it simply means in the States, it simply means teacher. A professor is some guy that teaches your kid maths or something. It's not very interesting and important. How to be an old architect? I start off with an old architect who isn't actually particularly known as a designer architect. It was just the last old architect I went to hear a lecture by. It was up the road at the Bartlett about 2 weeks ago. A man called Günther Feuerstein, who comes from Austria, and is a very special man. He has designed buildings, but nobody remembers much about them. He is more known as a very key influence. He was the guy that actually taught and discovered people like Coop Himmelblau and Hausrucker and various of the other key Austrian people. He was the guy that they all, when he was, I don't know quite what happened to him at the university there, but he was either denied a professorship or kicked out or something happened to him. And all the students came out on strike. And some of them never went back and never actually officially got their diplomas, but I daren't tell you who. And various deals were done many years later so that they could still become architects and professors. But he was a key figure, and he was the first person to really encourage my generation. He's a generation older than me, and he's still on the road giving lectures, very clear lectures. He's a bit deaf, so he can't hear quite hilariously when somebody asks him a question. It is then translated by the chairman who speaks German into his ear. He then answers in perfectly good English, but I digress. So that is one role for the old architect, to be the person who has seen the whole movement happen, has encouraged people who have subsequently then become world figures, and is still there commentating, explaining it to further generations. Here is this man in his 80s talking to people in their 20s and 30s about people who are in their 60s and 70s. It's a very interesting sort of cycle there. Here is a man roughly contemporary with me who you might know from this institution, who you collectively gave a special diploma to as he retired from here this last summer. And there he is looking, because he's had some health problems, probably looking older than he actually is. He, I think, would not mind being referred to as an old architect, though he's a good 20 years younger than the last guy, who's probably in better health. So that's also a fact of what you but when you get given a scroll as you retire, in a sense it underscores the fact that you are old and venerable and special. Are the people I'm showing, and that's surely so, they're only in my lecture because they're special. Of course, there are now millions and millions of other old people that are just old, boring people, quite frankly. Yeah, just because you're old doesn't mean you're special. But if you are special, or you become special and you're old, it does give you certain power, assuming you can remain in the vertical position. My first case is a man who is, God, I have to guess his age, but I guess he's sort of round about the 80 mark. Still active, still an architect in Buenos Aires. Clorindo Testa. He is famous for this marvelous building that was built at the end of the 50s. It was one of my pin-up buildings. I saw it in a magazine. Wonder what the hell it was. It looked unlike anything I'd ever seen. I pinned it on the wall and then didn't forget about it. I just thought, it's Buenos Aires, long way away. I'll never see this building. Bloody interesting thing. And then it sort of receded into my memory until, surprise, surprise, I got invited. In fact, I've been several times to Buenos Aires, and it's even better when you see it in the flesh. And it was epoch-making. It has a whole lot of extraordinary mannerisms and ideas, which I've talked about on this platform, I think, in earlier lectures. The Bank of was originally called the Bank of London and South America. And Clorindo Testa is technically born in Italy because his Italian, as many Argentinians are Italian, of course, his family wanted him to be born in Italy, though they were actually living already in Argentina, so that for the record he's born in Italy, but he's fully Argentinian. And this building is extraordinary from its spatial angle, from its technology, from its atmosphere, from its impeccable detailing, for it's really, I think, one of the most wonderful buildings of the 20th century. It has an extraordinary interior. It's now being used as an insurance company, and they've painted bits of it white, but they can't. It's too good to destroy. It's still a wonderful building. He then got, amongst many other jobs, he got the job of doing the National Library of Argentina. And the politics of Argentina were such that when I first saw this building, it was sort of sitting there but with no windows in it. And had been sitting there with no windows in it for some years. On a subsequent visit, they had put the windows in, and they even got a few books to put inside it. Not enough books to fill the building, such as the state of Argentina. But nonetheless, it's in operation as a national library. And so it was already a kind of historical monument. It was a piece of architecture of an earlier period by the time the first librarian was able to move in and start shoveling books around. It is a sort of extraordinary object. It's I think the drawing almost gives it away. If you look at that, it's very much a piece of sort of 60s thinking. I was there and I know. And it has, these suspended elements and almost pods. It has sort of neo-brutalist formwork. And it's debatable that it is not quite as brilliant as the bank building. It is in some ways more monumental. But it has, if you look at the plan, there's sort of Louis Kahn overtones even. But it's a hell of a thing to see in the middle of a park. He also has quite a reputation as an artist. He's had many art exhibitions, some which are of drawings and pieces of sculpture that are nothing to do with that. Some are of animals and so on, and some of them nothing to do with architecture, but a formidable creative artist. And a special guy. Now, in the sort of broad reputational scheme of things, Oscar Niemeyer, of course, is the most famous South American architect. But if Oscar Niemeyer didn't exist, I think people would take more notice of Clorindo Testa. And certainly, he's still operational and still a tremendous inspiration. And he gives very funny lectures. I went to one of his lectures in Buenos Aires, and I speak no Spanish. But just from his selection, as somebody who does spend a lot of time myself carefully selecting pictures for lectures, his selection of slides, the sequence of them, was hilarious. And he had the whole audience in fits of laughter for about a 2-hour lecture. This is a guy who's already well into his 70s when I heard the lecture. Extraordinary character and full on. And then after the bank building, he has done a series of jobs. This already now, quite a number of years ago, is for the design center in Buenos Aires, which is a sort of mishmash of odd bits of buildings that it inherited and odd additional bits of buildings that he had to make, colored in red and pink and cream, slight postmodern influences, and as a very eclectic mix. But when you get inside, it works. He's also done a beach resort, which is a very intense beach resort, meaning it's not really a beach; it's a sort of inhabited beach. So that the beach huts, which we know from the English tradition, are almost a settlement or almost a town of beach huts. And then he does private villas, a number of private villas, where again his sort of eclectic combination of constructed elements and almost art pieces, which are sort of added like quite willfully, is intriguing. Not to everybody's taste, a little bit probably passé now, but still developing, still moving. And some of his plan forms are really quite special. He's quite a fearless artist. He's one of those designers who knows exactly what he's doing. You know, if you want to see him do a very ordered plan, he can do it. So then he chooses not to. And if he shoves a room sort of off on an angle there, dangling in space, he's got a pretty good experience of knowing just how far you can go, and that the leaf pattern, or whatever it might be, is still working. And these are little sort of splurges that hang out of the thing, and these apparently dégagé pieces are actually quite thought through. And there you see the link between the Clorindo Testa, the drawer, and organizer of space. And I think his role in certainly in Buenos Aires, but he's also very known in other South American countries, of course, is such that he is this special person who's still at it. And he probably will, by now, never do another building of the size of the library or the bank, and doesn't need to. He is an inspiration. And because he also gives funny lectures, he's a digestible inspiration. And that's something that the old architect at best can do. Here's one of his houses, a strange piece of concrete work and a funny, slightly embarrassing-looking tree, and something that looks as if it's about to roll down the hill like a child's toy, but added to a very posh, rich person's house. An extraordinary thing happened when, some years ago, I brought him to lecture at the Bartlett. He'd given his lecture, and this house, I think it was this house, was part of the lecture. And we went to St. John's, which is a favourite architect's eating place, as you know. And his client was on the next table in London. Just so happened he'd turned the building, and there was the client sitting there, who was a lady who had studied at the A at some point, by the way. And here he is. He's not a long-haired, crazy bloke with a sort of drooping moustache and sort of, gabardine raincoat flapping. He looks like a bank manager. He's got a panelled room, and he wears a suit. And he's a very regular sort of guy. His wife and car and cigar, of course, so it goes with being an old architect. And that's also wonderful. But here's this guy that looks like a bank manager who does this wild stuff. So that's interesting, being an old architect. Bit of a trick one now for those who are well informed or not. Here is a quite old architect, about the same sort of age as Testa, who has done extremely elegant, calm interiors and well-poised elements. I wonder who's twigged it yet. Somebody's grinning, but maybe he just likes to grin. The next one might be the giveaway for those that know their modern architecture well. Who is this? Who might it be? It's Frank Gehry. Before he did the house, before he met his second South American, or rather Panamanian wife. I think I've on this platform before said that there are all these stories about when Berta came into his life, his architecture changed. I don't think it's quite as simple as that. There are various pieces of evidence that he was already well influenced by some of the artist's friends. That's the other sort of version of the story, that he was looking to what they did. But when you look at the elevations, I think, being an old architect myself and very much the product of the world of planned sections and elevations, one sees that actually there's quite a straightforward rationale. Isn't it interesting that all the windows, except for one, are horizontal? In fact, if you just take the windows out of context, they're very normal windows. They have, opening lights and glazing bars, and transoms and mullions, and all the usual thing. It is just the surface into which they're put might be in a funny place. And on another occasion, I think in my drawings book, I select out a piece of working drawing for this building, because what's fascinating about it is that the pieces are very straightforward. The normal kind of timber construction with framing. It's just that you put them in odd places. So it's as if I took this hat, wore it on my foot. It's still a hat. It still operates like a hat. It's just that it's not sitting on my head. And it's really the same analogy. So this old architect, of course, as we now I've blown the story, it is Frank Gehry, and it's interesting that in some of his buildings, the structure is becoming more and more important. He works maybe with better and better structural engineers, or in fact, even at this stage of his life, he's still investigating, still developing. One can then, of course, draw various threads of movement. To my mind, the Vitra Museum is in many ways as important as the house. The house is often seen as the marker of his change of mode, but really in the development of the later buildings, which use light and space much more interestingly than, let us say, in the period when he did the Space Museum, which was an interesting composition from the outside, but actually rather normal on the inside. The breakthroughs, I think, were made at Vitra. And the other thing is the kind of apparatus that he uses in his office and the sort of methodology that he has, which is also by now well known. He and his office collect lots of bits and pieces and objects and formal pieces. And this is the sort of office before the one that they're in now. But the collection of objects and the manipulation of pieces and the making of models is absolutely critical. So we've seen that one. Amusing to see his scribbling, leaving an instruction. And he's actually a very chatty character in private. He's a great sort of rather avuncular figure. Whether he would be avuncular if he was sort of working for him, I don't know. I only know him from a different perspective. But he's a very avuncular figure and very positive and kind of not exactly down home, but he's not stuffy in the way that the old architect in European context often can be. And of course, the rest is history, as we say, that there was the period when he starts turning rather than just cutting and juxtaposing, and then turning further. And I think that the question of whether the later architecture is consciously monumental is more a question of scale than necessarily intent. And as such, you can say he can get away with anything. I think that there is also the question of the culture. I was rather irritated by the degree to which the British critics were picky about this pavilion. I think it's one of the 2 or 3 more successful of the series of serpentine pavilions. But there was this sort of mealy-mouthed attitude to the fact that the structure wasn't strictly honest and there were bits of metal sticking out and blah, 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 blah. Mostly made by people who haven't got the wit to design anything remotely as good as his, but maybe I'm being over defensive. It is fashionable now amongst younger architects to dismiss Frank Gehry as a formalist. I think most of those people are jealous because they can't do it. Now, a person you probably haven't heard of, who is this man, and there he is sitting with his wife in a kitchen in Oslo. He only married her a few months ago, and though they had sort of been together for a while. And there he is. Now, if you look at that picture, you say, here is this Norwegian couple, here is this Nordic man, the sensitive face, his nice artist wife with a sort of Nordic breakfast, and it's very calm and it recedes. So let's sink ourselves into the notion of the older architect who is in a northern place and rather quiet, and that way that the Nordic people can be, and they can be very quiet, and it's very calm and simple, and the snow is outside. But he does stuff like this. There is the tallest housing block in Southeast Asia, as far as I know, going up, or perhaps it's now finished, in Singapore. Stylish, international, not a bit of the old creepy local Nordic thing. Well, you'd have to know a lot about his private life to know quite how that all meshes in. He has a professorship in Kansas. His office address is in Seattle, but he's mostly in New York when he's not in Singapore or China, or occasionally in London. And he is a sort of semi-freelance. I don't quite know what the deal is, but he's a sort of semi-freelance chief designer for NBBJ, which is one of the big international operations. And this is a building that he finished about 3 years ago or so. He was a student and an assistant of Mies van der Rohe. He left Norway, went to IIT for his postgraduate under Mies van der Rohe, and worked for Mies just before Mies died. So he is an old Miesian, and he still owns an apartment on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, complete with a set of Mies furniture in it. I don't think he ever lives, I think he just rents it out. But he still intellectually is committed and always is referring to the days with Mies. And in a way, this building, which has many things going on, you can, if you put your hat on, trace its Miesian overtones. But this is an old architect who is living the life of somebody who would be 40 years old, getting on as many aeroplanes as most 40 years old people, wearing neat suits and selling projects to China and anywhere else that will have one of his projects. Part of a corporate, or sort of part of a corporate organization. If the photograph is taken in a particular way, you sort of slightly remember his memories of modernism as it was, let us say, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, not afterwards, sort of almost back to me if you straightened it. It has that sort of grainy overtone that you see in those East European printed books about modernism. It has that grainy wish for the future and the indistinct. It's just a particularly trick way of photographing a building, which is very much in the present day, in a more commercial-looking perspective. This is the view of the whole building, which is the Telenor headquarters in Oslo. I think still the largest office building in Scandinavia, or one of the largest office buildings in Scandinavia, which is completely built now and has thousands of people working on microchips and cell phones and whatever else you do in telecom setups. he is also capable of extremely elegant, considered local styling, if you like, and some quite wild conceptual pieces. These don't quite get built, but he goes through them, and has won, I think, 15 competitions in the last 10 years. And so this is an old architect who's operating like a, I don't know, middle-aged, young architect. The fact that he's old, he looks, you see the photo, you think, oh, he's a nice, quiet guy. That's just one of his, that's his left leg. The real Peter Pran is got his flight schedules and his intercom and his, you know, the whole shebang. And I just hope he can keep it. He's also back still building in his hometown. He hasn't quite gone back to Norway, and I don't think he really quite wants to. His wife wants him to. But his new wife, but nonetheless, he has sometimes finds it possible to do both things. And maybe that is the role of the old architect, which is to be stubborn at a certain point and say logic and social security and healthcare would suggest that he lives in Norway. International operations suggest that he doesn't really live anywhere. Depends which address of his several addresses you want to use. He's not in Seattle. He says he's in Seattle. He's actually sort of in Kansas and occasionally in Oslo, but actually he's on a plane somewhere. He might be in, he could well be in London today. And that is a certain thing that is possible to the old architect, assuming his health can stand it. It was not probably possible some years back to somebody like Lebrunz. Lebrunz lived to the age of 91, I think, in Sweden, and smoked. In fact, nearly all of these guys, Pran doesn't. I think nearly all the people I've shown smoke cigars. But Lebrunz was obviously a cigarette smoker and lived into his 90s. And there, in a cloud of smoke, he was a neoclassicist, but also, I mean, there's also the question of the old architect, as with the younger architects. What happens in your local context? What happens in vis-a-vis how you are regarded by the scene around you? That Testa is by far and away the most brilliant architect in Argentina. I'm sorry, there's nobody that even still comes close to him. If you include Brazil, then it's a conversation. If you include Chile, it might be a conversation. But if it's just Argentina, he sweeps the board. They haven't bred anybody. Sorry, there may be an Argentinian sitting here who thinks he's better, or she's better, but the jury's not out. Lebrunz, on the other hand, had, and you know, Peter Pran, if he wears his Nordic hat, would say, whilst Sverre Fehn lives, he is clearly the great architect of Norway. But Lebrunz had bloody Gunnar Asplund sitting round the corner. There are famous stories in Sweden about a guy with a bicycle and a basket on it who used to cycle from Lebrunz's office to Asplund's office with the book of Schinkel details on it. And if you look at their early work, you can certainly Lebrunz's, you can see one bit of it is absolutely straight Schinkel. But here is I chose to scan not one of the finalized plans, but a sketch plan done by Lebrunz of the South Cemetery in Stockholm, which I think is quite sort of wild. There's a sort of what am I trying to say? There's a dynamic about it which you don't get from the more formalized drawings. Though when he built his first famous chapel, it looks at first sight one of those Swedish late classic sort of Swedish late classic piece. until you start looking at it, it has the same characteristics as Asplen's Villa Snellman, which I was once with a busload of both Swedish and AA students, as a matter of fact. And the bus, we drove past the Villa Snellman 5 times because it didn't look like anything special. We said, it can't be that, it's just an ordinary house. And somebody said, no, it is the Villa Snellman. And in fact, then we all traipsed out of the bus in the snow and looked very carefully at positions of windows in the snow. Said, yes, it is actually the Villa Snellman. Now we'll wear our isn't it special hats, which makes you very cynical about these things. But this chapel is very special. If you look carefully at the plan, it's not just a bad drawing. The entrance portico is at a sort of, 1 3/4 degree shift from the rest. And when you look at the sky between the portico and the main body, you see this strange fillet of light. And you then find they're very interesting, that scenographically it uses maybe classical system of interpretation, but what's going on is very special. And the light quality, the way the window is very carefully poised to light the altar in a certain kind of way, all sorts of tricks of positioning. It is actually a rather marvelous building. A bit later, he does a building which I think is one of is loved by rationalists. So all you see is this sort of rational, modern, late 1920s. I think I'm a bad historian. I might have got the date wrong. Somewhere around that time. I.e. before my time. It looks a straight, and then you go inside, and that is the evacuated space. He scoops it out, not just with a sort of circular scoop, but a big scoop. Of course, the fascinating thing to me is that his rival, Asplen, around the same time has done the library building, where the circular tube, as it were, comes out of the rectilinear architecture. Leverance cuts a hole where the circularized architecture is scooped into it. Now, maybe that's just me doing the old standard academic trick of saying, X and Y. Might not have been remotely in their minds, but you sort of keep remembering, you think, one pulled it up, one pushed it in, so to speak. And then he went and became a door and window manufacturer. For about 15 or more years, he set up and made windows. And I know somebody who lives in a building, in fact I go in and out of that building when I'm in Sweden, which has doors and windows done by Leverance's company. And he made windows and doors. Didn't appear to do much architecture at all. And then he started, don't forget he lived a long life, he started doing architecture again. He must have by this time been 50-something. So there's some period between his sort of, around when he was in his late 30s, 40s, didn't do much architecture at all. And came back to it when he was about 50 or 60. And he did this church in Stockholm, which is in a much more romantic mannerism. And his masterpiece of the more romantic work, because it still used light, amazingly, is this church in Klippan in the southern part of Sweden, which looks a bit calm on the outside and has amazing things going on in the inside. It has this undulating floor. It has light coming in from very strange positions. It has moments when, I think I might have talked about it here before, where you sit on a seat and the window is such that as you look out of the window, the ground, the field outside just runs from the bottom of the windows. It's as if you're some sort of mole sitting on the ground and just seeing the flat Swedish landscape just running out of it. And then it has these scoops that capture fins of light that wash down. And he's very, very, very good at handling light. But he goes into this other mannerism. And then later still, he's by now well into his 80s, I think, does this small neo-brutalist building, which was looked at by people like Peter Smithson and latterly by Enrique Marias. And they both borrowed from this building. This little flower shop to the cemetery in Malmö. One of the first people to use the idea of knocking a hole in the concrete and then just planting the glass straight on it, which Sverre Fehn also uses later. And at the age of 89, he's still doing competitions for churches. This is a church that he did. It wasn't built at the age of 89. And it looks like he's moving into another architectural phase. That's how to be an old architect. That's being a really old architect, still at it. Sverre probably be highly offended to be in the bracket of old architects. He is Polish-born, Israeli, lives in Berlin, if you get your head around that. Sort of boulevardier. He's very charming, has lots of ladies who swarm around him, and elegant, and I think really enjoys living in a city such as Berlin. He did a school in Berlin which enabled him to go there, and he got a taste for returning to Europe, and occasionally is in Tel Aviv, but mostly is in Berlin. And he did this building. When I first saw it about 20 years ago, which is when it was just built, I thought it looked like the AA origin group NATO. It looked like the sorts of things that the NATO group, which is Nigel Coates' people, were drawing. And I took one look at it and I said, that's bloody NATO, that's what NATO were doing, but he's built it. There's also another wonderful apocryphal story about this building, which is when the first Iraq war was going on, and they were zapping Tel Aviv with Scud missiles. Somebody phoned the police and said, "There's a building there that's obviously been hit by a missile," and the police went up there and said, "No, it's like that usually." And this is absolutely true story. And it's across the street from where, when he is in Tel Aviv, he lives. He lives in another building that he did many years before, which is a sort of 60s thing on legs. Also quite an interesting building. And he lives across the street from this one. And I don't think many people want to live in it, but it's only got about 9 apartments. It's quite an extraordinary, it's a very naughty building because it's actually in quite a posh suburb, and he deliberately uses materials that are associated with very cheap suburbs and crappy buildings, and he uses them also with bits of glass and so on. Very naughty man, very much, as most people who studied in his period at a place called the Technion, very preoccupied by geometries. There was a whole big geometrical preoccupation there. And he does these very complex geometrical things. He also, like Clorindo Testa, does a lot of drawings. Again, has exhibitions in art galleries sometimes of his paintings and drawings. And for a long time was only really talked to by artists because all the other architects thought he was a loony, until he started to become internationally successful. And then all the other Israeli architects gathered around him again, because obviously, you know, if the foreigners think he's good, he must be good. And so he thought, fuck you, and went and lived in Berlin. And there he is, you know, as the sort of artiste. I don't think he's got a cigar in his hand. And that is a certain role. So the older architect who has, at a certain point, has the mandate to say, I don't want to stay in this scene, I will go to another scene, who has used one or two or possibly three different milieux and has built in them. And then say, I will choose where I want to be as an older architect. I will choose the lifestyle I want. He has enough income and lots of bright young architects who work for him. And you choose your milieu. You don't have... He has been a teacher in the States and in Israel and other places, but he says, no, Berlin seems to suit me. I've done one of my best buildings there. It's good. Maybe my Polish childhood prepared me for that. Okay, that's what I want to do. He's done some weird stuff in the past. This is a town hall, but extremely boring sort of suburb of Tel Aviv. And I don't think they've ever recovered from it. Most of the people who live in this town are very, very tedious and wouldn't understand a piece of good architecture if they saw it. So maybe he said, well, why not? Although it wasn't early work. And then in the school, once when he was taking me around this school, and it was Daniel Libeskind who chaired the jury that gave him the first prize, he said, you know, and by this time he was already, I guess in his late 50s, he was in his 60s, I guess. He said, you know, I have come back to Europe and I have to rediscover the window. He says, if you build in the east of the Mediterranean, windows there aren't the same demands upon the actual nature of the substance of a window. And he says, I've been sitting here looking at the Berlin window, the history of the Berlin window, looking at the history of the window, the history of how you place the part that has to deal with weather in relation to the opening. He says, I've had to actually consciously relearn this because you can't just do general purpose building. That is a real architect talking, who has certain organizational mannerisms, certain artistic mannerisms, but in the final analysis has to make the window. Now, Isozaki is an architect who has a very, very special place in the Japanese architectural scene, and also is a good personal friend of mine, as several of these people are. But it's very I have great difficulty because a lot of his buildings I don't like. I like and admire him, and I think I probably had some of the best architectural or general conversations, cultural conversations of any I've ever had with Isozaki. He's an extremely wise man in the great tradition of wisdom, of knowledge. The first time I met him was in 1968, and late in Italy. And later that year, we went to teach together in UCLA in Los Angeles. We taught together for 3 months. And when I arrived there, I was playing some music to him on what was then called an EP, a little 45 record. And it was at that time hardly known English group called the Pink Floyd. They were not known at that point. They had made one little record. And I'm playing this, and Iso says, Pink Floyd. Somehow he knew what was going on in the English rock and roll, whatever you call it, pop music scene. How he knew, I do not know. Till later I realized he's just very, very well informed, very wise. He would know half the conversations going on in the AA at this moment, somehow or other. He's just a smart as shit guy. But some of his buildings are embarrassing. And, you know, at the top right is one of his early sort of neo-metabolist projects. On the bottom is, I think, is it Kuwait or Qatar, I get it muddled up, at the National Library building. And in a sense, it's a sort of return or a re-quotation of what he was doing as a very young architect. Intriguing, that. And then on the bottom right is another of his more recent buildings. He can design in any mannerism. And I suppose in criticism one would say that's the problem. When he's on form, he is an extremely elegant designer. This is something, so this is sort of middle period, early middle period Isozaki. From it's a piece of the interior of the Gunma Prefectural Museum, which I think is one of his best buildings, and he can be very, very, very good. But I don't know what it is. Does he want? Is it that he wants to please? Is he that the characterization of Japanese eclecticism, that you've got to be up with it, or else? And yet, as a thinker, as a personality, he's extremely calm and unruffled and well distanced. It's only when he gets to be a designer, when he's a good designer. I'm completely perplexed by this as a phenomenon. He's actually a very good designer, but somehow there's some aspect of the culture. Nonetheless, he is now treated as the wise man. And you know, there are things that he's done in the past, like one of the Olympic buildings when Barcelona had the Olympics, which very characteristically is sort of a bit of this and a bit of that, has actually extremely advanced technology in its construction. But there it is, looking sort of faintly kind of stilted in this sort of, am I wanting to be classic or am I not way? And then, of course, you know, famously, the things like the Mocha in Los Angeles, now completely outgunned by the fact that there is a good Moneo building, a good Morphosis building, a good Gehry building, and now a good Co-op Himmelbau building, all in the same block, or virtually in the same block. Things get hard, you know. It was, when this went up, there wasn't much down there except some second-rate skyscrapers. But now there's some, the guys have moved in. And this is a sort of funny little toy, you know. And then he has his Disney period. Maybe there will be a revival of I mean, even I find it sort of hard to take, but maybe it will go back into, maybe you guys will actually do stuff like this. You know, because you'll get bored with doing that stuff like in the other room there. Or you get things like, now, we did an exhibition in this building. Archigram brought its exhibition to Mito, which is near Tokyo. We said, wow, it's this building. Da, 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 da. Wow, that's going to be all right. You know? Except, wait a minute. At the bottom of it is this thing. The actual building that you do the exhibition in is here. And this is a sort of wonderful totem pole. Weird, you see. And yet, he is a good guy. Now, Sverre Fehn, who's now quite ill, but still alive, and some people tell me still drawing a bit. Here he is with Stephen Hull, who, of course, has Norwegian origins. Stephen Hull's ancestors were Norwegian, so maybe that's why they're enjoying a drink or two here. And there is the famous building. Still the best thing in the Biennale is the Nordic Pavilion, which Fehn did when still a young architect. And it is an extraordinary, wonderful space. His key building, I think, is still, sorry about the rather crappy scan, is still the Heimar Museum, north of Oslo, this old bishop's house, which has this extremely aggressive curbing ramp that dives into the building, dives through the building, this very, very assured, tough incursion of the new into the old. and a number of very elegant villas, if you know where to find them. This is one in the north of Oslo. And a terrific way of drawing and talking. I had the privilege of teaching together with him some years ago, and he's an extraordinarily inspiring guy. When he gives a crit, he does funny drawings. And then sometimes he does sort of curious buildings that are bordering on the eclectic, but they're always much more controlled than the Isozaki equivalent. His ultimate genius moment would have been this building if it hadn't been kicked. This won the competition for the extension of the I think it's the City Theatre in the centre of Copenhagen. And there you see Fehn's beginning of his addition onto the theatre, an extraordinary piece. And then the Danes blocked it. There's some skullduggery went on, and although Fehn clearly won the competition with this very beautiful project, somehow it didn't happen, and there are all sorts of nasty stories that circulate about various prominent Danish architects making damn sure that this talented Norwegian would not get the job. And so after he won the Pritzker Prize, and the people of Oslo were very embarrassed that they'd been sitting on this guy for so long, not giving him any work. And finally, as he gets into his sort of wheelchair phase, he builds the extension for the Oslo Architecture Museum, which I think I've shown here before. This glass pavilion surrounded by a wall with an interstitial space of about 2.5 meters, so that the new building is almost a secret. You sort of peer at it, you sort of peek and see the secret. But from the inside, the wall has a very important role to play. Immaculately detailed, very almost religious space. And then another building, he gets 2 buildings as the guy's almost incapacitated. They finally start giving him work. This is a big insurance company in the center of Oslo where he keeps the old house and then builds the new building around it. The old house becoming, and with a very interesting roof condition. You see this sort of apparently standard roof which has peculiar, again, the ability, I think, of the northern architects to deal with light is very particular. I think if you take all these guys, Leverance and Asplund and Fehn and so on, because light is so precious, you have to be very clever to use it. Whereas you go down in the Mediterranean, the fucking sun is there all the time, only just to keep it out. Okay, I exaggerate, but the Nordics have to caress it, have to treat it preciously. Just a few more picks to finish up with. And that is done. It's down here, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. And the obvious ancient architect, he's now over 100, I think he's 100 years old, is Oscar Niemeyer. Whether he's still designing, I suppose it would be nice to think that he was. I can't get it off. And there he is, as we all know and love him. He has done these extraordinary heroic things I mean, he goes even almost into a category beyond which I don't have a lecture for, because, oh, right, it's doing something wrong. Yeah, it should be on there. That's it. Thank you. He must be in a position to be able to see himself as a historic. I have this thing. I think I've said to you guys on occasion. If I look at things like Plug-in City, it's like looking at a piece of history, almost if it's done by somebody else. Now, he is a lot older than me, so he's got that, God knows, over twice or 3 times. What the hell do you do if you're looking back to stuff you did 80 years ago? The hell do you think about it? It's a different age. It's a different millennium. Can't help us. And it's difficult to disassociate him from being really so much the representative of all of South, from where I sit, sort of all of South American culture, that South America has to be treated as really a most critical territory for the discussion of architecture in the last 100 years. This stuff was already well known when I was a student, and an inspiration and something you couldn't even comprehend. When I was a first-year student and saw this, didn't even know quite how it would have been made. It was unlike anything that I could see in southern England, and therefore was weird shit of the most extreme kind. What was it about? And to do things like this, I mean, I'm still wanting to do myself to do things like this, to be able to say that a horizontal piece of shading or surface or road or roof doesn't have to just do that. It sits on legs that do this. It can draw onto space. He did it, These things I mean, if you a photograph like this for somebody of my generation is slightly embarrassing. It has overtones of sort of Mussolini and, it's a sort of crown of thorns and then Mussolini or something. It's a bit, but he did that as well, The most exciting of his stuff that I have been to, I think, is this, which is the Ibirapuera Park in Sao Paulo. It's a crappy photograph, but it has these enormous buildings. I mean, this is a very, very large building indeed, where we worked on the Biennale. My piece was about as big as that dot, but it's an enormous building. There's these big exhibition buildings, museums, sports buildings, and this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful device here, which is simply a horizontal piece of concrete that's about half a kilometre long. And when you're working on the exhibition here and you need to eat in the restaurant, which is, I think, there somewhere, you just walk, you go for a walk. It's like going from here to sort of Tottenham Court Road Station or beyond, that sort of distance. So you go for a walk at lunchtime to get a meal down the end. And you're under this piece of concrete, which doesn't do anything except has a couple of skateboards and a lady with a dog underneath it, and odd visiting Englishmen who are hungry. It's just, me brought up in the UK in periods of endless, credit crunches and ups and downs and sideways, and can we do it for 500 quid kind of psychology. A piece of concrete that just keeps the sun off you and has the odd bod under it. It's sort of, it's wonderful. It's sort of extraordinary. So, not to underestimate. And then it can be, it's not just big lumps of stuff and big geometrical gestures. If he wants to be able to control light and do it elegantly, he can do that too. So don't underestimate the 100-year-old architect and think he's a one-liner. He's got about 93 lines, and he can pull most of them off, even stuff that one wouldn't know quite how to, something like this, the rules of the aesthetic, the kind of terms of reference of it, are extremely difficult for a North European to get their head round. Is it decoration? Is it fretwork? Is it new ways with concrete? Is it symbolism? Is it look no hands? Is it? All one's normal referencing drops away. And maybe that is the role of the old architect, to be able to surprise you, not to necessarily play it by the rules, not to necessarily stay in the town that you were meant to be, not to necessarily remain as an academic or remain as a builder. Maybe you can become an academic late in life, or as I'm hoping myself, you can become a builder late in life. You can say, no, I don't want to do that anymore. I'm not doing that anymore. Or you do a leverance. You disappear from the scene totally. Just when everybody's written you off, you come back in again. Wow, that is a privilege. And so we got, whatever it was, 3 or 4 years ago, a sort of sweet little piece of whiff of Niemeyer. This very enterprising lady from the Serpentine Gallery went and fluttered her eyelashes extensively and chatted him up into doing something he wasn't really bothered to do. He wasn't going to come over to England, but he scribbled a bit of this and that, and somebody interpreted, and it's made out of tin, actually, which is rather hilarious. He being a concrete man, they built it out of tin or metal. And my final person is still also very much alive. I think he's also hitting the 80-year mark, or might have gone over it, I'm not sure, and is a man called Pancho Geddes, who will be lecturing actually at the Bartlett in about 3 weeks' time, and is a Portuguese who spent a lot of time in Africa. He was the son of a Portuguese doctor who was in Mozambique, and at the time he had to leave Mozambique, had done, so he says, 400 buildings in Africa, many of them not published. He'd done 400 buildings. And then he had to leave Mozambique because of the politics and became then the Dean of Architecture in Johannesburg at Witwatersrand. And he is a jolly man, now being given many, many, honours by the country he was born in, which is Portugal. He's finally made it as a famous person in Portugal, but was treated as, again, like many, he is also a person who draws a lot, does a lot of art pieces and sculptures and drawings and so on, like Clorindo Testa and some of the other people today. I finish with a foretaste. I'm going to bring him back next week. I'm going to show you much more Pancho Geddes stuff next week. I thought it was rather nice to have this bridge between the old architect, who happens to be an interesting architect, and intriguingly, his last major exhibition in Europe has been in Switzerland, which I find fascinating. What are the very uptight Swiss doing with a hilarious free thinker like Pancho Geddes? That's an interesting one. But the young David Green and I were sitting many years ago when we first got to know each other. We were sitting in an office about a mile west of here, and we saw this stuff in a magazine. We said, "What the hell is that? Who is this guy?" And then you become lucky enough to meet the guy who really exists and has continued. That was years ago, for Christ's sake. That was 40 years ago. He was already intriguing the younger architects. Who was this man in a funny place that you'd never heard of? What was he about? And he has become still a hero of mine. And now, interestingly, has, like Spiehäcker to some extent, like Leverance, one of the things about some of these guys is their amazing resilience. They reinvent themselves. They change countries, wives, mannerisms, hats, cigars, and continue to become more interesting. Unlike many people who already at the age of 26, you can see, I mean, being an old teacher, I can say one of the most depressing things about teaching are the 26-year-olds who already are 60. And there are more of those than the 60-year-olds who are still 26. And I say that not in general criticism, it is an honest opinion. And I don't care whether you don't agree with me, because I'm an old architect. Thank you.